is my pleasure to introduce Laura Kiesel from Save Arlington Wildlife. And I'm going to turn it over to her, and she's going to give us a wonderful, sad, but wonderful explanation of why we need to rethink how we're fighting our rats. Thanks, Laura.
So thank you very much for joining me today, and I really appreciate that people are masking. I'm immunocompromised, so that's why I requested that. So I've given different variations of this presentation for the past 2 years now, and I've been involved in advocacy on this issue for nearly a decade, though it's really ramped up in the past couple of years as more public awareness has increased. So just to start off, this photo that I have for this cover, I changed my photos depending on where I'm presenting. This is actually a red-tailed hawk that was found by a Somerville resident, Morgan Pinney. I don't know if she's here tonight. Hi, nice to meet you in person. It was in the general, I think, Union Square neighborhood, and she was rescued by Cape Ann Wildlife. This photo is courtesy of Cape Ann Wildlife, admitted for care. Initially, the hawk did seem like it was on the mend, but unfortunately crashed. Her vitals crashed and she died. The internal exam showed a lot of internal bleeding consistent with anticoagulant rodenticides, and a formal necropsy was performed and showed that the death was due to eschars poisoning. I want to start off my presentation with a quote from Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring. The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can do so only when it is in full possession of the facts. So tonight I'm going to try to share as much of the facts that I have with you, and hopefully we can make some more decisions, including policy changes going forward based on that. So a little bit about me. My first degree is in English and journalism, but then I went back to school for wildlife biology, and eventually I completed my master's degree in natural resources and environmental policy. And for many years, I've sort of been combining those two interests by being an environmental journalist, combining my science knowledge with my writing skills and background. And when I became involved with this issue, it basically landed on my doorstep in 2015. I moved to Arlington a couple years before that, and one day I was actually at the time living in affordable housing because journalists don't make a lot of money. And I came out into my parking lot, and there was a pest control professional, and he was placing 20 bait boxes around the property. And I asked him what's in it, and what immediately struck me is that, well, first he told me they were traps, and I was like, that's not traps, that's poison, correct? And he clarified it was. And when I went to speak with the landlord, they had no idea what was in these boxes, how they worked. I had to explain to them, if my cat catches a mouse that's eaten this poison, my cat could become ill, the children could become ill if they stick their hands into these bait stations. It could kill, a red-tailed hawk nest that was in the area. I was worried about that. So I started advocating back in 2015. I wrote this article in 2018 for Dig Boston. Actually, a lot of the article is about some of the really good methods that the city of Somerville was using at the time. And actually, I had a quote from a representative, a city official, that was saying that they had moved away from using eschars on their public properties. And I was kind of disappointed in trying to do more research around the time that this hawk became sick in November to find out that the city of Somerville does now use eschars again on its public properties, including its schools. In 2021, I did a follow-up piece also for Dig Boston, because at this time we were now getting several bald eagles that had died in the area due to these poisons. One of them was in Arlington, and I'll go a little bit more into that in a minute. This article was then syndicated as a cover story in Salon, and it was shortlisted with 4 other articles for the David Carr Award for Investigative Reporting. And I did a lot of deep dives in this piece about the role the EPA has in enabling the widespread use of these poisons, the pest control industry. So it goes very deep into those things as well if you're interested in learning more. As I mentioned, I'd been advocating on this issue since 2015, but starting around end of 2021, early 2022, in the aftermath of these bald eagle deaths and several other high-profile deaths, specific right in my town of Arlington. I founded Save Arlington Wildlife. It basically started as a website, but then it started to kind of gain momentum, and I started doing a lot more advocacy around it. So we were founded in early 2022. We raise awareness on rodenticides, and one thing we also do is we seed and mentor other groups in other towns and cities that are trying to kind of replicate the Arlington model, because Arlington so far is the only, well, now Newton has joined us, the only town that publicly that banned escars on public property, and we had a home rule petition to the state to ban it on all property, and I'll also get more into the details about that. So we work with other Save Wildlife groups and other organizations in general to collaborate to push for both municipal and state level legislation. And currently we have chapters and initiatives in Belmont, Lexington, Waltham, Winchester, and Newbury, and I know there are a couple of people here who are trying to work on getting a nascent Save Somerville Wildlife chapter off the ground too, if there are other people here tonight who want to get involved with that effort. So just a little bit of a quick review of some of the terms. I'm not going to say all of these. Even after all these years, I still have problems pronouncing a lot of these chemicals. But there's, we're talking about rat poisons in general, or rodenticides, and there are several different kinds, classes of them. The ones we're going to be talking the most about tonight are second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, or SGARs, and that's a mouthful. There's also first-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, or FGARs, and then there are ones that are not anticoagulants, which are bromethalin, which is a neurotoxin, which is still sold over the counter, and cholecalciferol, which is basically a fancy name for vitamin D poison, like a bait made out of megadose of vitamin D. As the name suggests, these anticoagulant rodenticides work by stopping the blood from clotting in whoever ingests it by inhibiting vitamin K. Vitamin K helps the blood to clot. Just so folks know a little bit about the history, the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, the reason they started making a second generation is because rodents started building an immunity to the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, and they also needed to eat a lot of it to die. The SGARs were specifically formulated so you get a lethal dose. A rodent can get a lethal dose when they first eat it, but they specifically did a lag time so that those rodents still take several days or a week or more to die. So even though they get a lethal dose, they're still eating more and more and more. So by the time a predator eats them, they have their body is kind of chock full of these poisons. Their liver has a lot of these residues in them. So I'm going to ask a question that I've been thinking about in my years of doing this advocacy, especially in the past few years. I've started to think that SGARs may be the new DDT that we're dealing with. And I know there's other chemicals too that also this question has come up, but I'm going to talk about the reasons why for me this resonates a lot as something that is very similar to DDT. What I'm going to talk about is the bald eagle. For people unfamiliar with the history of the bald eagles were wiped out of Massachusetts completely by 1970 due to DDT. It was impacting, in this case, fish, and they were hatching eggs that the egg shells were too thin, and so their chicks couldn't hatch. And so they were unable to have offspring. DDT was banned in 1972. That was almost a full decade after Silent Spring was published, so it still took 10 years after the publication of that book to still get DDT to be federally banned. The bald eagle was listed as endangered, I think technically in 1969 before the ESA became law, and then it took till 2007 to be removed from the federal endangered species list. So just think about it. It took decades of vigilant efforts by state and federal officials to help the bald eagles recover enough to get off the federal endangered species list. But recovery in a lot of states have been slower. And in Massachusetts, they were still endangered until 2012, so only a little over a decade ago. And they were actually still threatened until 2020, late 2020, I think. And they're currently still listed under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act as a species of special concern, and there are about 80 pairs in the state. So I want us all to think about this. In 2020, they were demoted from threatened to species of special concern, and then in 2021, this eagle in Waltham, that's a picture of her in 2021. That's her on the left, and then that's her 2 weeks later being removed after she died, was found dead. She was on top of her unhatched eggs. While her mate looked on, they removed the body. But I want to also point out that that's only the death that the state first considered formally, because it did a formal necropsy. They had been banned. I think they had been tracking her. But this was another bald eagle in 2018 in Cape Cod that was exhibiting all the signs of anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning. So I just want to qualify that when I say the first bald eagle, it's just the one that the state formally listed because it was necropsied and studied. But there are many other anecdotal stories of bald eagles by wildlife rehabbers that were showing signs of poisoning. So, like I said, I'm from Arlington. In 2021, we had our first bald eagle's nest since bald eagles were eradicated in like the 1960s in the border of Arlington. And this was the first, her and her sibling were the first eaglets to hatch since like the late 1960s in Arlington. She looks like a Jim Henson creature. That was my first glimpse of her. That was C25. This is a few months later, so I basically would go a few times a week. Like I said, my background's in wildlife biology. I just want to point out how lucky I felt, because in my studies, I had been to Alaska to study wildlife, and I was seeing more wildlife in the Boston metro area in my backyard than I was seeing in Alaska. I saw one eagle once all the way in the distance when I was in Alaska, and here was an eagle nest right in my neighborhood that I'd go visit 2 or 3 times a week. So this is C25 a few months later. As she was fledging, she was already like flying around outside of the nest, and I want to point something out if people can see it. Do you see these little green flecks? So Escar's bait is usually a phosphorescent blue or green. It's so iridescent that it actually stains the intestinal tracts of rodents, and when you can sometimes tell when the predator is eating the intestines of the rodents, not trying to be graphic, because you'll see the bright green or red. On this day, which was the 4th of July, I thought it was a pretty holiday appropriate thing to go visit the nest on Independence Day. I watched their mother bring them a large rat and them kind of rip it apart, and I saw the green splatter on her feathers, and I was really worried that that was Escar's bait. I was hoping maybe it was a trick of the light. But then 2 weeks later, she was found collapsed face down on the ground. This was the last photo that was ever taken of her as she was being put into the transportation container to be brought to Tufts Wildlife Clinic. She died 2 hours later. And so that was the second bald eagle on top, in addition to the Waltham bald eagle I just pointed out, that had formally been confirmed by wildlife officials in the state as having died of Escar's poisoning. Just to let you know how low these populations still are in the state, most people think that they're cousins, the Waltham eagle and the ones in Arlington. Now, the mother of C25 was born in the Charles River near where the one that died was. So that these populations weren't even here like 10 years ago in this area. So this is C25's mother. This was my first glimpse of the bald eagles in my neighborhood of MK in April 2021. Before I even saw C25, I saw her flying, and then I saw her land on this post sticking out of the Mystic Lake. It's my favorite photo of her just because she's preening, she's scratching an itch. It makes me feel like she's not just mortal, but vulnerable to me a little bit in this photo. And I keep that photo over my bed at night. I watched MK for the next 2 years. As I said, we went through the death of C25. The next year, she did have 2 offspring that successfully fledged without a poisoning incident. But then in March, actually late February of last year, so we're going on the year anniversary, she was found on the ground as twilight approached. Now, eagles are diurnal predators. They don't hang around on the ground after daylight. So to see them on the ground at night, you know there's something wrong with them. So some rescuers who were worried scooped her up. They sent her to the New England Wildlife Center where they were treating her. She made it through the first night, and they thought maybe she'd pull through. But the second night, she actually she had a severe hemorrhage in her, I think it was her lungs, and she actually choked on her blood and died. So this is not just a Massachusetts phenomenon. I do think Massachusetts has some higher rates than other states, but they've done studies that this same study came out the first month that I saw MK back in 2021, and it found that over 80% of American and golden eagles in the United States that they tested in necropsy, and this was over throughout the entire country, had tested positive for eschars exposure. When MK died, I was very upset, and we had dealt with a lot of recent wildlife deaths. So I had, the day she died, I said, let's all meet at the Common in Arlington, have a vigil, and then march to the town hall. And 300 people showed up. I was not expecting it. It was 24 hours notice. As you can see, it's still very cold out. It was like slushy weather, like it was damp out, and yet 300 people showed up and marched. So obviously a lot of people really cared about this issue, and I really feel like it was kind of a watershed moment of realization for some officials on the state level that this is something that really, I actually didn't mean to play that, but you can see, I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's several minutes, but that sort of has, I feel like there has been a bit of a paradigm shift in public consciousness since then, though I do feel like it hasn't quite expedited the amount of change I would hope to have by this time. Now, one of the reasons people were so upset in March was it wasn't just the eagles. Around, also in 2022, the town of Arlington, we had this family of great horned owls and I don't know how long it had been since that park had had any owls, but similar to the eagles, I would go in 2 or 3 times a week and watch them. I watched them hatch, I watched them leave the nest and fledge. This is, again, a picture that was taken after they had mostly left the nest. They were probably going to fly off soon, and then one day, the mother and one of the babies were found inches apart on the ground. And they were not formally necropsied because the state usually does not necropsy animals that are not under the endangered species list. But the ACO at the time did do an initial exam, and she did a dissection, and the animals were still spilling like watery blood, and that's a very telltale sign of anticoagulant poisoning, is that the blood is not turning tarry and black. It's still spilling out like Kool-Aid even post-mortem, which it's not supposed to do. And that made the Boston Globe did a whole feature on it because and several other television stations because there was such a public outcry. And so the following November, that was in the spring of 2022, and then this was Thanksgiving 2022, I was really excited to see the male find a new mate. I don't know if I clarified, in addition to that mother and offspring, the third offspring was found a day or 2 later dead as well. And it's not clear if she died because of eschars poisoning or because she didn't have a mom to take care of her, because the mother usually does the bulk of the rearing, and the male figure helps. Now, great horned owls, they mate for life, usually. They spend most of the year together, they preen each other, they groom each other, they take care of the offspring together. They do these duets that are really magical in the winter. If you ever get an opportunity to watch them, they'll actually sing to each other, and then they'll do this whole display, balletic display, and then they'll land on the branch together and they'll mate, and they'll do this for hours. So I was very excited to see him find a mate again because their natural instinct is to be paired. And then 2 weeks later, she was found on the ground coughing up watery blood. And she was rushed to a wildlife clinic, but unfortunately she died en route. And my community and I actually banded together to crowdfund for her necropsy because we were tired of some officials saying, well, you're not sure if that's poisoning, right? And the necropsy showed definitively that she had very high lethal doses of eschars in her system. And it's not just owls and it's not just eagles. This was also I was also watching a family of Cooper's hawks in my neighborhood around Spy Pond. I don't know if people are familiar with Spy Pond in Arlington. This is one from the nest. That's where it fledged. And then around that same week that that second owl was found dead, that Cooper's hawk was found in someone's yard. And we also crowdfunded and did a necropsy. And it was high rates of bromadiolone in particular that seemed to be accountable for the death. And the reason I wanted to mention the bromadiolone is something that I've stumbled upon in a lot of my research, is that pest control companies are telling a lot of government agencies in particular, but even homeowners, that bromadiolone is the low toxic eschars and it's not as harmful. That's not true. as you can see, it was mainly accountable for the death of that Cooper's hawk, and I've seen other necropsies where it's one of the primary ingredients. And this has just escalated a lot recently, and I don't know if part of it is people have more awareness, so they're noticing these birds more, or if it is because we're sort of getting the fallout of now several years of having these escars be a pervasive staple in the metro area. But this is just from the past month. Several birds that that's a screech owl that was found in the left-hand corner in late fall in Arlington. There's another screech owl that was just found right before Christmas, and we did a necropsy on that one. And that screech owl was in Arlington, but it was right on the border, right near the Stop and Shop at Alewife Brook Parkway of Somerville. I just picked up a barred owl 2 weeks ago, and that was another red-tailed hawk in the corner found at Spy Pond. In fact, on New Year's Day, I fielded 3 dead red-tailed hawks in 2 hours, one in Arlington, one in Watertown, one in Peabody, to try to get those bodies picked up and necropsied. And the next day I had another 2, and the next day I had another 2, just to let you know the just sheer volume at which like dead bodies are kind of piling up. Now, this isn't new. The level seems to be escalating, but this happened all the way back a decade ago in 2014. I don't know if people might recall. Ruby the red-tailed hawk and her mate Buzz, they were nesting right on that main central building at the Fresh Pond Mall. There was a live cam set up to like record them 24/7, their comings and goings. And Ruby was found dead right beneath her nest. And she was necropsied. And I think that was the first death that really hit the mainstream, that made a big feature in the Boston Globe. And there was a slight uptick in awareness and some efforts in Fresh Pond for people for those businesses to not use poisons. But as you may have seen, if you've been there and noticed these boxes, they're still everywhere around Fresh Pond, including that building where that nest was. Tufts Wildlife Clinic, which is the clinic that picked up C25 and picked up Ruby and did her necropsy and many others. They're actually one of the leading authorities on the topic of anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning and rodenticide poisoning in general on birds of prey. Dr. Maureen Murray is a vet there, and she did a study. First, I think it was 2006 to 2012, and she found 86% of the birds of prey necropsied found in Massachusetts had escars exposure, and then she duplicated that study only a few years later from the 2012 to 2016 time span, and that jumped to 96% of birds of prey had been exposed to escars. And also 100% of red-tailed hawks, which makes sense because they're both the most common bird of prey in Massachusetts, but they're also one of the birds of prey that really primarily eat rodents. And like I said, this was one of the most recent ones that happened in the area right here in Somerville. But it's not just raptors, it's not just birds of prey. Coyote are very susceptible. Foxes are very susceptible, in particular, not just directly from escars poisoning, from their blood from hemorrhaging or the more direct impacts. In fur-bearing mammals like foxes, coyotes, bobcats, and cougars, it causes mange. It makes them more susceptible to the mange mite, and what happens is they may not die directly from the poisoning, but the mange will kill them, especially when you get like sub-zero temperatures in like places like New England. You can see that mountain lion, he has a very severe case of mange. A lot of these pictures are of wildlife, not the coyote, but that fox is one with mange that has escars poisoning. That skunk was one that died of escars poisoning. That possum was an escars poisoning case. A lot of people don't realize how many animals really do eat mice and rats. A lot of those omnivorous species like skunks and raccoons, like possums, crows eat mice. Even herons eat mice and rats as well. And it's also pets. So the MSPCA has said that they get dozens of cases of rodenticide poisoning annually, that these cases peak during spring and fall, that the cost of care can exceed $2,000 and takes weeks of supportive care and medication. This is a friend of a friend. She had this rescue greyhound in New York, and right before Christmas, this was just last month, they were staying at an Airbnb that was listed as pet friendly. They had the bait stations with escars because of the heavy rains. The bait flooded out onto the grass. As you know, dogs sometimes eat grass. The dog died that night. She's actually now kind of in an entanglement with Airbnb to remove. She wants them as a policy to not have pet friendly if they have rodenticides on their property, because she feels like she wouldn't have rented from that Airbnb if she had known that they had rat poison on the property. And it also goes to show that those tamper-resistant bait stations have a lot of ways that they can still be exposed to poison as well. This is another dog. This dog just died 2 weeks ago in Massachusetts. This actually was not an escars poisoning case. This was bromethalin, but I just want to mention it because some pest control companies are moving to bromethalin as escars become less popular. And bromethalin's still sold over the counter. But this puppy got into the bait and died, and there's no antidote for bromethalin. And I want to go back to really one of the first times that the government got involved in any regulations on rodenticides and escars in particular was not even due to its impacts on animals, but its impacts on children. Studies were showing, poison control and ER admittance records were showing that thousands of children every year were winding up in the ER with rodenticide poisoning, usually escars poisoning. These children were disproportionately low-income children, usually in low-income affordable housing, and predominantly black and brown, which made this an issue of environmental racism and environmental justice. It was actually West Harlem Environmental Action that brought up a lawsuit against the EPA for allowing these to be sold over the counter. So up until 2015, you could buy escars over the counter. And after that lawsuit, they basically decided, okay, you can't sell escars over the counter. And I just want to say that ALEC, I think it's called the American Legislative something Commission, which is just this lobbying front group for a lot of conservative interests. They had this memo that said that amount, 10,000 children, was an acceptable risk for these rat poisons when they were fighting against the regulations. Finally, after a lengthy legal battle, they came to a compromise that they were going to pull the escars from the store shelves. They still were allowed to sell out some of their existing inventory, but the EPA guidelines still allowed pest control operators to market and use these poisons in so-called tamper-resistant bait stations. Well, first I want to address, has these changes benefited children? So it definitely has led to a decrease in escars poisoning for children, not an elimination, but a decrease between 46 and 79% since those changes. However, there's been a corresponding increase in FGARS poisoning for children in that same time span of 60 to 80%. So it just seems that the poisons have changed. There hasn't actually been an overall reduction in the poisonings of children. And I want to point out, when I had those escars bait stations at my affordable housing complex, I regularly saw the children, my neighbors in the complex, sticking their hands into those bait stations, playing with them, touching them. And it always very much concerned me. Some parents didn't even know what was in them because sometimes it wasn't even properly labeled. So the EPA has now taken them off the store shelves, but there's a few problems with that. One is that you can still buy it on the internet in big, bulk amounts. There's this really great feature article, if people want to check it out, on Audubon magazine about that. And the other problem is, well, like I said, these tamper-resistant bait stations are not as resistant always as people want to believe. Sometimes I've had them, pest control, some pest control professionals have called them tamper-proof, which is not true. But this was a cracked open bait station that I found, and this was right next to the Petco in Arlington Heights, and there was a puppy training class where they were bringing the puppies outside, and one puppy was pulling to try to smell near there. So I did have to report that bait station for the town to get them to remove it. This was another case in Arlington where the squirrels cracked open the bait station, and you can see on the left-hand picture, the squirrel has the bait. and is eating it. And the people who lived there reported that a few days later, all of a sudden you had all these dead squirrels on the ground. And the other problem, as you may know, is these bait stations do nothing to address secondary poisoning. So the rodents still eat the bait, and then they leave and they're loose in the environment, and they're now the poisoned item that the predators can get. So I watched this red-tailed hawk last year for an hour, and I was like, what is he looking at? And he was stalking a rodent that had gone into a bait station. He landed on the ground, and there's a bait station right behind that thicket of grass. And I was debating whether to interfere when someone came out of the front door and he flew away. But I've seen this regularly. I've watched hawks in my neighborhood stalking the rodents while they're going in and out of bait stations or in and around buildings. The EPA knows that this is a problem. Every couple of years, they do what's called an ecological risk assessment, and every single year for over 20 years, they have concluded that these poisons are very dangerous, and yet they keep just allowing it to still be legal. But this was the conclusion of the 2020 report. The nature of risk to mammals and birds from anticoagulant rodenticides is well established and includes mortality from primary and secondary exposure, as well as chronic growth and reproduction effects. And I just want to point out with that quote, even when the animal is not dying, as I pointed out, there were several nests that got disturbed, right? There was the eagle that was dead atop her unhatched eggs. There was the owls that died, and then the mate died. So in other words, that year we didn't have babies. We didn't have another population. So it's not just about the direct death rates. It's about the impacts to the overall population when they can't reproduce successfully, because these keep impeding on their ability to have a population somewhere. Now, the EPA just released its latest report at the end of November. I haven't had a chance to read through the entire report, but this article just came out yesterday. So the EPA has found that the rodenticides in general, but specifically the escars, are pushing dozens of endangered species toward extinction, including Florida panthers and California condors. And so the question might be, well, if it's such a problem and the EPA knows it and they keep concluding that it's a problem, why are they still allowed to be legal, these poisons? And I mean, quite frankly, because the pest control industry, very similarly to the fossil fuel industry, has a really strong lobbying arm in Congress and also at the state government level. I mean, they brag about it a lot. I read their trade publications regularly. This is a really good investigative feature in ProPublica that talks a lot, not just about rodenticides, but of other pesticides too. And there's a revolving door between the EPA and the pest control industry. They leave the EPA after their appointments, and 8 out of 10 times they probably go work for the pest control industry. So this article details much better than I have time to tonight. If you want to read up more on that, about how that's working. And this was another feature, investigative feature series that The Intercept did that, you may have heard a couple of years ago in 2021, which was around the same time I started doing my second article, researching for that. A bunch of whistleblowers got terminated because they were saying that the EPA was fast-tracking through a bunch of chemicals without actually assessing them correctly for safety due to political reasons. And also with the EPA, I read through their 2020 report, and so even though they were very conclusive that these poisons were harmful, they were basing that on pretty scarce data next to what really exists. So if they actually had better data too, it would even be a more overwhelming case. So for instance, I think that the EPA said that there had been 700 to 800 poisonings across the entire United States in the past 7 to 8 years. But they only are basing that on reports from 3 states in the entire United States, Massachusetts, California, and New York. And I can tell you Massachusetts does not have a comprehensive system for this, so our rates alone are pretty low. But let's just compare. So the New England Wildlife Center, they treat between 100 and 200 cases a year of anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning. That's just one wildlife rehabilitation center in one part of one state, and they're getting 100 or 200 cases a year. They're the ones that tried to save MK. They have also noticed that their patients are taking longer to recover, the ones that do survive, and that they're requiring more in-depth treatment. So this owl in this photo was one of a nest. He had, I think, 2 siblings and his 2 parents. He died, as you can see, he's bleeding profusely. And his other sibling died and both parents died. There was only one survivor. And that surviving owlet needed to get vitamin K infusions every day for 9 months before his blood would clot again on its own and he could be released. They said that it was unprecedented. They never have seen anything like it. But it does offer a compelling case that perhaps it's showing how much more ubiquitous these poisons are in the environment, that they're seeing these kind of unprecedented cases. And again, similar to what I spoke about, what we experienced in Menotomy Rocks Park, you're getting these complete nest eradications. It's not just 1 or 2 animals, the complete nest is being wiped out, where maybe there's 1 survivor or no survivors. And so you then don't have that population of that species at all in that area for a while, or just maybe 1 animal. And that is actually counterproductive and counterintuitive if we want to manage or rein in rodents. A single owl, great horned owl, eats 4,000 mice a year and over 1,000 to 1,500 rats. If we eradicate that owl from the environment, those are thousands of more mice and rats we're going to allow to breed here, because poisons cannot compete with what natural predators can do for a bunch of reasons. The reason why we're in this predicament is because the NPMA, which is the National Pest Management Association, has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars lobbying politicians in the past 15 years. And when I was doing my article, I had interviewed the EPA. It took months for them to answer some of my questions, but I had noticed that a lot of the pest control companies I was speaking to would point blank tell me, like, this does not kill wildlife. It does not work up the food chain. And I'd say, I'm a wildlife biologist, and they'd say, you don't know what you're talking about. But it's legal for them to do that. So the EPA press officer told me it's not a violation under federal law for the PCO to make inaccurate claims about the impacts their products have on non-target animals. So if a pest control operator or professional is telling you that it does not, either they don't know what, they either are uneducated or they're not being truthful. And I find both kind of unsettling since this is their field. And I also interviewed a former pest control professional who was actually fired for promoting non-poison alternatives and being quoted in a media source of different kinds of alternatives to poisons. And he told me that the biggest commissions they get in his business are from the Rodenticides subscriptions, and you want them to keep coming. They're usually quarterly subscriptions, right? Every 3 to 4 months you refill those bait stations. And that's why they don't care. Now, I mean, this is just a quote from him and his experience, but there was also a peer review study that was done back in 2017. It was a survey of 24 pest control professionals in Massachusetts. And the respondents across the board showed a low level of awareness about eschar potency and half-life. So they didn't really understand how dangerous these eschars were. And yet all of them universally said that they were integrated pest management professionals, despite the fact that they were utilizing these chemical rodenticides pretty predominantly. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the term integrated pest management. A lot of people think it means poison-free. It does mean, usually it's supposed to mean a conservative use of poison, but there's no legal criteria for that, and I find that often it's still a mainline, first-line method that's utilized even under pest control professionals that say they're IPM professionals. This was on the National Pest Management Association's mission statement. It's to counteract activist efforts on both the national and local levels by being prepared to instantly respond on behalf of the industry. I called this out on my Save Arlington Wildlife Facebook page, and the next day they pulled it down and they reworded it, but I still found it on the Wayback Machine because it's still there. And the reason I posted that is because in Connecticut they were very close to banning these eschars, and then there was a full-fledged media campaign by the New England Pest Management Association that it's going to be Ratmageddon. And And so the politicians, the elected officials there kind of at the last minute backstepped a little and is like, well, now we're going to do, I think now they have sort of a round table of different people and they're studying escars, and hopefully they'll still ban it, but for now it's been postponed indefinitely. This was a bald eagle that was found right around the time that they were making that decision in Connecticut that was suffering from escars poisoning and died shortly thereafter. So these poisons, some of the arguments I often get is, well, there's the public health, there's reasons of public health, right? We don't want rodents spreading diseases, and we don't want to come in contact with rodents. What I've noticed anecdotally, since these poisons have become very ubiquitous since 2015, is I now regularly find dead and dying rodents around the area. And I'm talking in broad daylight with heavy foot traffic. Healthy rodents don't hang out on Massachusetts Avenue on 4 p.m. on an August afternoon like this one does. It's something that poisoned rodents do, and that to me would expedite more disease transmission. This rodent, I don't want to, it's probably going to try to play it for a second, but he was, even if you aren't very fond of rodents, it's a pretty cruel death to witness. And if you think about it, here in Massachusetts, it's illegal to kill rodents for pest control by drowning, but we're allowed to poison them, where usually the death is by asphyxiation on their own blood when their lungs hemorrhage, which is a kind of drowning, and that's what you're witnessing. So I did finally find the ACO came and humanely euthanized him and disposed of him, because I was also concerned that a pet or a a wild animal was going to pick him up. But as I was watching him at 4 p.m. There, you could even hear it. There's high traffic. There were children walking by me. There were people walking their dogs. So the dogs were sniffing it. So it doesn't really seem like these poisons are helping make us healthier or safer from the diseases rodents might spread. And here are just a couple of other rats that I've found. This one on the left was at Spy Pond. Again, for people who aren't familiar, Spy Pond is a very popular area, and there were two kids playing catch football right near this dead rat, and someone was walking their dog, so I had to find someone to help me clean up the rodent. And this other rodent, similarly, he wasn't dead yet, and I had to watch him spasm, and he was 2 inches away from a bait box, just like the other one I just showed, in front of someone's home who had 20 bait stations, and this home was 2 houses down from an elementary school that was letting out at the time that I saw this rat. So again, I don't really feel like these poisons are making us safer or healthier. And peer-reviewed research has kind of bore out my suspicions. This was a 2021 study that found that Norway rats that have ingested anticoagulant rodenticides were significantly more likely to have and spread leptospirosa. And I don't know if people have heard, I saw it on Facebook the other day. I know there was a dog in Somerville that just died 2 days ago of leptospirosa. And that's something that's probably getting exacerbated, those transmission rates of that disease, because more of these rodents have these poisons in their system. When you have these poisons in your system, you can't thermoregulate. It lowers your immunity to diseases, and you're more likely to get sick and spread it. And I do want to talk a little bit about why we hate and fear rats so much, because I think it is part of the problem. I've been doing this work for 9 years. Even today, I had someone interrogating me about all the diseases they spread, and I'm absolutely not saying that there aren't very valid public health risks with rodents, right? Especially if you have them in your home, you want to stay away from their droppings and excretions. But I do think that there's a lot of fear-mongering and a lot of exaggeration about the risks. I have been asked no less than 10 times in the past 2 months about rabies in rats. Rats and mice, it's almost virtually unheard of. They're not a rabies vector species. So again, I think that people sometimes worry about that. And I said, well, if you're worried about rabies, I'd be much more worried about, feral cats or raccoons or all these other animals that actually are rabies vector species. The plague. They can carry plague, but you're more likely to get struck by lightning than get the plague from a rat. And there are some valid concerns about property damage and causing fires, which is why you don't want to invite them in your home. And if you're baiting them into your home by leaving bait out, you're more likely to be inviting them in or around your home. But a lot of it I do think is entrenched in a lot of the folk tales and lore we've heard. Now, I was studying wolf biology, so I was very interested in this idea of stereotyping of animals and what we believe versus the reality. I've also heard a lot of really nasty comments about rodents, associating them with poor people and all sorts of racist or xenophobic comments. So just want people to kind of interrogate a little bit what we're thinking about when we say things about rats in general. I'm not saying that people have to go out and hug a rat. I'm just saying, like, we might want to consider that, because I really do think that fear-mongering is why we now have this very serious issue with poisonings. It's sort of like that metaphor of burning down your house to get rid of like a pest, but now your whole house is burned down. So like I said, they're not a rabies vector species. The chances of disease transmission is extremely low. They are more likely, though, to have and transmit diseases if they have poisoning in their system. You're more than 100 times more likely to be bitten by a dog than a rat. And really, a child is statistically much more likely to be poisoned by rodenticides than sickened by a rat. So another thing is, I've heard about the public health impacts when my affordable housing, when the landlord's like, well, we can't have a mouse or a rat because of the children. I'm like, but those children are sticking their hands in the bait stations with these poisons that are very dangerous. So can we maybe do exclusion? Because another thing I've sometimes noticed is when you're using poison, I feel like it's a bit of a distraction, at least in some of the places I've rented. They put down poison, but they're not cleaning up the dumpsters. They're not covering up the holes or doing the things that could really help prevent the rodents. And my affordable housing, we never had a rat in our apartment until after the poison showed up. And I've spoken to many other people in other low-income housing have had similar issues. They were like, now that they have all these poison bait stations, now they're getting rats inside their dwellings, which they did not prior. So also, rats didn't actually, like the best, most experts now believe that rats didn't spread the bubonic plague epidemic of the Middle Ages. So I just, again, wanted to mention that, since plague is usually conjured as a reason. We are getting more rats. And that's for many different reasons. Climate change, warmer weather means that usually when we used to have harsher winters more consistently, they wouldn't, procreate during that time, but now they usually breed year-round. More people equals more trash. We're becoming more densely populated. There's a lot of construction. Construction itself doesn't lead to rodents increasing, but it does draw them in, and it does interrupt their burrows, so you're going to see them more if there's a lot of construction. I have noticed that in 2015, like I mentioned, the EPA banned these from over-the-counter shelves. Around that same time, we were undergoing and still are undergoing a construction boom. It really does seem like there's been sort of this kind of marrying between developers to like put these bait stations down, and the pest control companies now have a monopoly on this product that is not available over the shelves, so they've found another way to market it, which is through like a lot of this development and increased residences, so they're putting them down there. The pandemic too, people might have heard, during the restaurant shutdown, some of the rats went looking in more residential areas because the restaurants were closed, but also people were home more, so they might have just seen more, not necessarily that there were more. And ironically, more poison everywhere is probably exacerbating the problem. And so there's not a single study. And I was actually surprised about this. I was expecting to find some studies, but I could not find a single study that really proved any efficacy that these rodenticides reduce rodent populations in suburban or urban ecosystems. So yes, you'll see dead or dying rats, but those are probably a very low percentage of the overall population. And the EPA and USDA actually, for this reason, like they recommend against extensive or long-term use of these poisons. The actual recommendations are to use these poisons when other things have failed for a very short time and then take them away. Because if you're leaving them out perpetually, you are leaving a food source out for them 24/7. So that's part of the problem. So it's being used against the recommendations. And sightings of rodents and reports of rat activity have only increased with the rapid rise of eschars. So if I were to create a bar graph, there was, it did talk about this, actually it talked about Massachusetts in the 2020 EPA ecological risk assessment, that both the rate of eschars and the rate of rodent sightings have just kind of increased in tandem with each other. So they would be kind of going up in a bell curve together, which at the very least shows that these poisons are not effective in reducing them, and I would argue probably are a contributing factor in perpetuating the problem. And here's why. The definition of bait is you're luring the animal into the area. That's why you're not supposed to put this bait down unless the rodents are already there. But if they're not there and you're putting bait, you're literally drawing them to that area where the bait station is. Something that I noticed, and I noticed this in Somerville when I recently did a public records request. I also did a public records request of Arlington a few years ago, is when they do a development of a new construction project, during the demolition phase, they have to get a pest company to come in, do an assessment, and then do some kind of management. What I was noticing is that the vast majority of places were putting down poison even though their assessments were saying that there was no rat sightings. So you're basically putting bait down even though there's no justification for it in a majority of the cases. Now in Arlington, I don't remember in Somerville offhand, but in Arlington it was 30 out of 32 properties they were putting down eschars, and 28 or 29 of those, there was no rat sightings or activity noted, but they were just putting down this poison as a preventative, which is not supposed to be used as. The other thing is rats and mice can build biological resistance to these poisons, similar to antibiotic resistance or immunity. So as I mentioned, the reason eschars even exist is because FGARs were not working because the rats and mice could eat it and a lot of them were not getting poisoned. Because they breed so rapidly, within a few generations, a lot of them aren't dying, they're just eating it and going on. And now studies are showing that similar to the eschars, they're also building resistance to. So we're creating super resistant rats to these baits. Rats can also learn to avoid bait. It's called bait shyness. They're very intelligent. Again, one of the reasons the eschars have that lag time where they eat it and they don't die right away is because they're smart, and if they started to get sick, they would be like, oh, this is what's making me sick. I'm going to communicate to my family members that this makes me sick. But even with eschars having that lag time, there's studies that are showing that more rats are going to avoid that. And you know what? If you're luring them to the area with the bait and then they look around and they're like, oh, but there's all this tasty trash out, they're going to choose that instead of the bait. And rats and mice can outbreed the poison, but their predators can't. So a single couple, rat couple, can have like 1,000 or 1,200 babies a year. But their predators, like a single eagle or owl couple, they're only having 2 or 3 babies. And as you can see, those entire nests can get wiped out by poison. And then you've extirpated those rodent managers from your area. And when you kill off a natural predator, and I learned this in Predator-Prey Dynamics 101, which was an actual class I took, you're going to artificially inflate the prey population when you kill off their predators. It's like it's called a trophic cascade. This is from Raptors Are the Solution, so this talks about that dynamic I talked about where, the rodent smells the bait, they come in. By the time one generation gets killed off or moved on, the next one gets lured in by the bait if you're just perpetually leaving it out. I kind of wish there was also a little graphic about what it does to the predators and how it inflates the numbers. Something I might want to work on. Really, at the end of the day, the best way to manage and prevent rodents is to manage waste. That means getting rid of bird feeders. I'm an avid birder. I love birding, and I used to have a bird feeder as well, but there have been studies that show that places that have bird feeders are 2 to 3 times more likely to have a rat nest within 10 feet of it. At the very least, people should not have them during the warmer weather seasons and should remove them overnight if they do like their bird feeders. Things like not leaving compost outside, keeping your compost indoors or refrigerated, picking up pet waste. Even something as simple as taking the trash out right before pickup, the night before, the morning of. It's a big problem. I see a lot of overflowing dumpsters. I lived in Alaska, as I mentioned, and due to the grizzly bear population, it was illegal. You are not allowed to bring your trash out until the morning of pickup. You are not allowed to have a bird feeder. And I do sometimes wonder if we want to be more serious about rodents if we should consider more restrictions on when we're putting our trash out, when we're having certain like feeders or things that attract them. And also, like I said, an emphasis on exclusion, making sure these buildings really don't have entry points for rodents to get inside a dwelling. So some of the things I've done with other people, with Save Arlington Wildlife, is we started a poison pledge-free campaign where we went around to different buildings and businesses and asked them if we noticed they didn't have bait stations. We asked them if they wanted to sign up, and we kind of give them this kudos where we give them this sign, and we would give them props on our Facebook page and have like a go shop there day where we would try to push people. I feel bad for some of the smaller businesses because some of them are constrained by the property owner that they're renting their business at. I've had a lot of business owners say, we don't want this poison here. We have complaints, but the landlord is insisting on having it here. In Arlington, we've pushed to restrict anticoagulant rodenticides and other poisons on municipal lands. In particular, in 2022, we became, like I said, the first municipality to ban it on all our public lands and buildings. We weren't really at the time using it much, but it's good to codify that. But we also submitted a home rule petition to the state to say we want to ban it everywhere, because unfortunately the state does not allow cities and towns to ban pesticides of any kind on private property. And I just want to say that that is actually something that the pest companies lobbied very hard for. About 30 years ago, towns and cities could ban pesticides, and the pest control industry went around lobbying to all these states saying, take that right away from the cities and towns. You don't want them having that right. So, because they said it'd be too much paperwork per town, and so here we are 30 years later, and only 5 states allow municipalities in the whole nation to regulate. But we did put in a home rule petition, and Newton joined us after MK died, and we're asking more municipalities to consider doing the same, because there is a trend. If the state hears from enough municipalities and gets enough home rule petitions, that they will probably revise their policy. We also asked our Board of Health, after I found out that 30 out of 32 of those demolitions that they had bait stations, I published it. So they got some feedback from people who didn't like that. So they did change their policy in Arlington, and they no longer allow SGARs for those pre-demolition phases, unless there's an exemption if there's like a public health emergency or a huge rat infestation. But so our Board of Health in Arlington doesn't allow SGARs at those pre-demolition sites anymore. And we also urged our housing authority to ban SGARs, and they did, Arlington Housing Authority, as well as the Housing Corporation of Arlington, which was my affordable housing complex that I was living in all those years ago that I mentioned. They no longer use it. Another thing, this is a really great citizen science project that Claire could probably talk about in a couple of minutes, Earthwise Aware, which does a lot of tracking of seasonal changes in our flora and fauna. There's now this great database that people can go, and they can take pictures of where these bait stations are, if they're labeled, and also if there's like the existence of a nest or a den, or if there's been any dead wildlife reported, you can report it here as well. So I've already spoke about the home rule petition, and the city of Newton, like I said, has followed suit. So now it's Arlington and Newton, and I'm working with some other municipalities who are, for this town meeting season, also looking to ban SGARs. We also went to the State House this past spring to fight for, there's a state bill that would return the rights to municipalities to regulate these pesticides, and not just let the state have the rights, so that we wouldn't have to just piecemeal do home rule petitions. That's this bill if people care to learn more about it. Unfortunately, the legislative session is about to end in a few weeks, so it's probably going to die in committee, and it'll be resurrected again. And that's our home rule petition in the town of Arlington, which people can also write to the State Committee of Environment and Natural Resources, because even if you're not in Arlington, if they grant our home rule petition, it would help establish a legal precedent that would make it easier for other municipalities. This 4th of July, the Boston Globe also did a top-page editorial in favor of Arlington's home rule petition and asking that the state do more to rein in these poisons because of their impacts on bald eagles and other sensitive species. So finally, These actually are some of the strategies that I got from the city of Somerville back when I did that article in 2018. You know, rat-resistant trash toters, requiring licensing and inspection of dumpsters, a contrapest pilot. Contrapest is actually a kind of fertility drug bait for rats and mice. I know that I was told it did reduce in those 2 test sites the rat population by 57 to 67%. I know that due to costs and some other complications, I think the bait also freezes in the winter. Somerville steered away from that, but I'm hoping maybe they'll consider that or other options again and move away from poisons. High volume electronic traps, which I know Somerville is utilizing to some degree, as well as several other municipalities, and just more education and awareness. And better signage and enforcement of wildlife feeding laws, which are a big problem, I know, especially near ponds and rivers. I know some places have tried carry-in and carry-out policies for trash in parks with some mixed success, but it might be worth revisiting for places. There has been more success for increased trash pickup multiple times a week in certain heavily populated areas or parks. My affordable housing complex actually did do that eventually. They did twice a week trash pickup instead of one, and we saw a reduction in rodents. And more of these kind of big belly canisters, I do see that Somerville has gotten a lot more of these in recent years. And the reason why it's so important to me, why I travel to all these other municipalities, is there's only so much that Arlington can do. Like I said, we've banned it on our public lands. We're trying to get the state to let us ban it on private property as well. But wildlife do not adhere to municipal borders. MK the eagle nested in Arlington. She was found on the ground in Arlington. But in the weeks leading up to her death, she was spotted in Winchester, in Belmont, in Fresh Pond, part of Cambridge. I think she might have been spotted in Somerville, I'm not sure, but I know she was definitely spotted in at least 4 or 5 other municipalities. Also Woburn at Horn Pond. So if she's picking up, as she inevitably is, rodents and eating them there, she's still going to come back to her nest here and get sick. And so unless we have more coordination between municipalities to tackle this issue, it's going to continue to be a problem, because the wildlife, they travel throughout the watershed and the different denning and nesting areas, and I want them to be safe wherever they go. So I can open it up to questions, but just in case you want to support Save Arlington Wildlife, that is my PayPal, and I also have a Patreon for Save Arlington Wildlife, and there's also a bonfire store where you can buy a rat poison is wildlife poison t-shirts. And I am actually getting a nonprofit called Save Massachusetts Wildlife that I'm starting, and then it will be tax deductible, but I still have Save Arlington Wildlife just as a grassroots group, because for people who don't know, you can't do nonprofit activities if you're lobbying for political change. So Save Arlington Wildlife is still going to be my little group to do more of the political stuff, and then Save Massachusetts Wildlife is going to be doing more of the education and awareness and helping other Save Wildlife chapters and initiatives like grow and flourish and do work in their own home communities. And I also have a little donation box there for people. And this was our Menotomy Rocks Park owl, that's Mason, who is still alive and now has a new mate, and he's been spotted breeding with her regularly, and so we're sort of, a lot of the Arlington residents are sort of fingers crossed that if they have babies, they'll be safe this time around, but you know, there's a lot of trepidation about that. And I want to just end it before the Q&A. I started with a Rachel Carson quote. I want to end it because I wanted to point out so many of the parallels between DDT and eschars. How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Yet this is precisely what we have done. We have done it, moreover, for reasons that collapse the moment we examine them. So I'm open for questions. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you about red-tailed hawks, because I used to see them all the time many years ago, because I loved them, and I would be driving down 128 and see one. And I just noticed it seems like you don't see that many around anymore. And I don't know if there's been studies of different populations that are decreased
Okay, I'm just going to repeat your question so they can hear me with the mic for the recording. So the question was whether red-tailed hawks, have there been studies to show that they've been decreasing in the general area in recent years? And I don't think there have been. Like I said, there have been studies by Tufts Wildlife Clinic to the exposure rate of birds of prey and red-tailed hawks in particular, and it shows that that exposure rate has jumped significantly just in the past decade with 100% of red-tailed hawks. And when I speak to wildlife rehabbers, I've been interviewing like a lot of wildlife rehabbers about this issue. Across the board, when I ask them what are the species you see the most of, pretty much the consensus is red-tailed hawks. So they do seem to be the most vulnerable. Again, probably because they're the ones that are primarily rodent eaters, whereas some of the others have like more varied diets. And they're the most common birds, so they're also going to be most exposed. And I find that they're also very adapted well to urban environments. Like owls can be too, but they're also nocturnal and they tend to kind of stay in a certain area. Like great horned owls kind of stay in a certain space that they inhabit with their nest most of the year, but I notice red-tailed hawks really get around. They go to a lot of different places, so I think that might also be why they're so vulnerable. Thanks.
Hi, I just want to acknowledge, I'm Tori. Hi. I want to acknowledge Councillor Will and Ba. Thank you, Councillor, for coming. Councillor Ba is also chair of the Open Space, Energy and Environment Committee, so this is a pet project of ours. Thank you and congratulations on your hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you. I actually wrote you an email inviting you, so thank you so much for coming. Yes?
I've noticed in my neighborhood, red-tailed hawks in the past few years seem to have been displaced by Cooper's hawks.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a thing?
Again, I don't know if there have been any comprehensive studies to show displacement. Now, it is true that Cooper's hawk seems slightly less or somewhat less susceptible to Escar's poisoning than red-tailed hawks, so it might be that they're thriving more because of that. As you did see, they do still succumb to Escar's poisoning, as that case I pointed out. Cooper's hawks are primarily birders. They eat songbirds and sparrows instead of rodents, but they will eat rodents as well. So that might be one reason we're seeing more of them, because maybe red-tailed hawks are being impacted. That's a hypothesis I have because I have noticed more Cooper's hawks lately as well, and I think that may be a reason, but there's been no studies that I know of about the exact population dynamics going on in the metro area. I wish there were more studies to track this in this area. And I think Earthwise Aware is attempting to do more, studies about sightings, and we could probably map some of what people are seeing and observing. That would be an interesting thing to look into. Yes?
Hi, I'm an Arlington resident. I just want to say thank you for all the advocacy, research, awareness that you're doing on this topic. I just, sitting here listening to you, realized what that home rule was all about, because we can ban it on town property, but we have all kinds of retailers like Whole Foods, like Petco, like Unleashed, like all these places that, especially Whole Foods, that place is so crowded, full of people who are probably well-intentioned. They're shopping there for its organic food and things like that. And surrounding it are bait boxes, which are poisoning our community. So I'm understanding that this home rule is really the key to giving the communities the right to ban it on any property. Because now we're restricted, right?
Yes, because the state law does not allow us to ban rodenticides or any pesticides. That was what she was mentioning, that without the home rule petition, we just don't really have a way to ban on private property, unless that proposed state law that would return the rights to towns and cities to do that gets passed, which is, I think, a harder climb, actually. And also, there is a precedent in the state level of, if you get enough municipalities to submit home rule petitions, where the state often will review its state policies independently without legislation. It's done it on a few things on renewable energy and climate change. So that's also why I hope more municipalities will consider passing home rule petitions, because then I'm really thinking that would compel the state to understand that this is a serious issue and that they have to revise it. And again, if they do grant it to Arlington and Newton, I think that would set a pretty strong legal precedent of why Arlington and Newton, but not other municipalities. The The wildlife rehabbers I speak to do say that Arlington, Cambridge, Somerville is like a hot spot. Places in the New England Wildlife Center, there on the Cape, Cape Ann Wildlife, which is in Gloucester, they say that the bulk of their cases are coming from this area. Again, this is the metro area. That's probably one reason why, but because we have such heavy usage here of eschars. But yes, that's important. So home rule petitions are definitely what we're trying to work with. Mass Audubon has also really gotten behind the idea of working with municipalities to try to get them to do home rule petitions as well, because I think it's really the key to fighting this problem. Because if we can't do it, if we can't get rid of it on private property, which is where most of it is, it's still going to be a huge problem. Though I still think a lot of municipalities that are using it on public lands could really set a precedent by doing it on their lands too, because the problem is, if you're going to do a home rule petition but you're using it on your public lands, the state's going to say, well, why are you trying to ban it on private property if you're using it on public property? You have to show that you're trying to do it on your own areas first, what you have under your jurisdiction. So thank you. And yes, I also want to mention we did have, for Whole Foods, we had a whole Whole Foods campaign trying to get them to stop using poisons, especially since it seemed to contradict so heavily with their mission statement of animal welfare and sustainability, and they just were not having it. So there's still, if you go to savearlingtonwildlife.org, we have a frequently asked questions sheet. We have alternatives to rodenticide, but we do have information about our campaigns, including our Whole Foods campaigns as well. It's still worth talking to businesses. Again, some of the problem is not with Whole Foods, but some of the smaller businesses, they can't do anything because the landlords are the ones that are putting it on the property, not the small business owners that are renting from those landlords. Morgan?
Yeah,
Yes.
so I'm Morgan Finney. Actually, that talk that you showed us, the first
Yes.
page, is the talk that I found right after Thanksgiving. Thank you for the talk. I did want to ask if you can say anything about what California has done.
Yes.
And the state of California has banned,
Yes.
my understanding, these
Yes.
eschars. And
Thank you for cueing me, because there's so much, and I'm like, I know I'm not going to mention something unless I get cued for it. Yes, so the state of California has banned eschars on most sectors. There's a few exemptions for like wineries, breweries, and I think like some like livestock farms, but for the most part, it has banned it throughout most of the state. Right now, it's the only state, but California is the 5th largest economy in the world, so it's a pretty strong precedent. And right now, I think I mentioned Connecticut is considering a ban, as is New Hampshire. Those have been kind of indefinitely postponed because the pest control industries have been lobbying so hard against those. But I feel a little sheepish that the more conservative states are a little further ahead than Massachusetts and at least trying to ban this. So California has banned it, and British Columbia in Canada has also banned it. And I want to say at first they did a temporary moratorium. And what happened was it was so successful that after the year moratorium, they adopted it permanently. They said there was no net cost to the economy. And I'd like to say both California and British Columbia, there's been no ratmageddon, because some of the argument is like, oh my God, if we ban eschars, like the rats, but there has been none. In fact, the pest control industry has been really fighting that, like, oh, it's an environmental justice issue. You have to let the poor people have their eschars. But like I said, it was West Harlem Action that tried to get it banned over the counter. And the city of Richmond, they had an environmental justice group that wanted it banned everywhere. And then the pest control company did a rebuttal to them, like, you don't know what you're talking about. You need these poisons. But the environmental justice group was like, no, we don't want these poisons. But it got permanently adopted, and it's been very successful. And so I think that these are pretty strong precedents for Massachusetts to learn from as well. So thank you for that. Yes, Claire.
I just want to add one thing. Other countries also, of course, face the problem. And there is some very good publication from the Australia government and Europe as well. Europe as a whole, I'm French, by the way, but Europe as a whole set of issues around, neonicotinoids, etc. But there's an interesting resource that we have on our website on the SGAR Brigade, which is about the economical incentive or kind of studies about alternative methods, and actually showing that there's a good incentive to go the other way.
Yeah. California also had a study that found they did a test site where they just let the hawks and owls, no poison was allowed, versus one with the anticoagulant rodenticides, and it was like hands down the site with the owls and the hawks significantly more control of the rodent population versus the one with anticoagulant rodenticides. So the peer review research that exists shows pretty unequivocally what exists so far, that they're more successful at controlling rodents than the poisons.
And one thing that I wanted not to add in that effect, but my question is, because we discussed about that, Laura, we have a few folks from the Friends of the Fells there, and I'm thinking the Fells, the DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation. And you told me that you made a request, am I correct? Because you know that DCR on their property use actually escars.
Yes.
So there must be baits, devices at this location, and Laura is trying to find an answer to that.
Yeah, so I've heard that the Department of Conservation and Recreation uses escars on, I don't know how many of their properties, but they do use it on their properties, which I think I mentioned, I've heard from other, I've been doing some research recently on New York, and they use it too on their properties. So I have a pending public records request to try to see where they're using those bait stations and what's in them. And that's been taking a while, but I'm hoping to get more information about where, because I do think, I know with the state of California, that's where they started. They started by asking the state to ban them on their conservation and green spaces under their jurisdiction. And they did that first before they did the more full-scale ban. What was happening in California is that they're supposed to undergo an environmental review to allow the use of these escars in places, and the state, when Raptors of the Solution did kind of, I think it was like an injunction or something to see, it turned out the state was just rubber stamping the use and doing no environmental assessment, similar to what I was saying with the EPA. And so then there was like a lawsuit, and then someone did do a law, and that's how the ban eventually came to fruition.
Yeah. And just to to nail the thing a little bit more, anecdotally, before we created the SCAR brigade, the SCAR brigade, we noted a few incidents of rodents that were behaving or exhibiting SCAR symptoms in the fells. Right? So something that to keep an eye on. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is, it's funny with California being mentioned. It reminds me a little bit of, it seems like all of our efforts to control rats are predicated on the assumption that you can get rid of rats by killing them.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. And it reminds me, there's this whole thing, you can look it up on Wikipedia or listen to your favorite podcast or something, but there was an effort in California during World War I, they called it the Squirrel War, to eradicate the California ground squirrel because of its impact. And it was essentially a massive social experiment to see what could happen if you devoted an entire population to killing a specific animal. The government was paying people for every dead squirrel they brought in. Young boys would go out and catch a few of them and all that stuff, make a couple bucks. And it completely failed. They killed millions and millions of them, and they didn't. It's still there. It's still one of the most common species there today.
Yep.
And that was squirrels. They're way dumber than rats.
Yeah.
And it seems like everything from our municipal code to our insurance requirements to our HOA laws is all predicated on the assumption that you can control a rat population by killing individual rats.
Yeah.
And it just seems like there's no evidence that method works.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So where does one begin addressing that? It sounds like the real solution is some kind of balance, figuring out how to control them by other means and limit their food and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's similar to what I was saying about that kind of anecdote, you burn down your own house, or you and then the rat's still there. It survived. It just went underground, and we're kind of, I feel like anything that's predicated on we're going to eradicate this species, we're going to lose, because we're not going to eradicate rats, right? It's never going to happen. And as long as we're trying to base any control or management on that, we're going to not only fail miserably, but we're going to wind up taking down other species and ironically inflating the very species we're trying to eradicate in the process. Because I really do think it's a combination of, like I said, better waste and trash management, because it's really about cutting off their food sources and excluding them from areas as best as possible. And yes, then you can do some trapping or some lethal methods in certain areas when you have a specific, and that's what those escars are supposed to be for. I personally don't think you ever need them. I don't agree with their use in any case. But like I said, even under recommendations, it's only supposed to be when all other methods fail for a short term. If you're having, a public health emergency, you put it in, you poison that population and you take it away. And then in theory, you're supposed to remove the corpses, but if they're running away, you're not getting them. But and then letting the predators do their work. Unfortunately, like the rats also play an ecological role in our urban ecosystem as a food source for our predators as well. And I saw something in one of the city of Cambridge's leaflets about rodent management, which was sort of like, yes, the predators are never going to completely eradicate the rodents. And I was like, but the poison's not either. And I don't understand, do we really think we're going to do that? But when you look at I want to do an infographic of like how many rats or mice, like owls and hawks eat versus how much really poison can kill. Because rats and mice can learn to avoid bait, right? Like I said, they learn it. It's called bait shyness. They can't really avoid the predators that they've evolved millions of years. The predators have learned. I mean, I don't know how many nature documentaries you've watched where those owls can go under feet of snow and hear a mouse and get it out and kill it. They're going to find it. You know, they're not going to build, the rats and mice are not going to build biological resistance to the predators. So I think encouraging a healthy, thriving urban ecosystem with our predators, as well as, like I said, better trash management and waste management and exclusion, and then to some extent deterrence and trapping to supplement is probably the best solution. And that will require also understanding that sometimes we're going to see a rat once in a while. But I do think we would see less than what we're seeing now with them like dying in the middle of the street at 4 p.m. On a Tuesday afternoon with children walking right by them. Yes, Mary.
So I'm Mary Verniotis. I'm a Somerville resident, and I'm very interested in what is the next step here, and I feel like it's getting organized as a community in order to do something about this. So I don't know where Renee went. She's over there. I didn't talk with you about this, Renee, but I don't know if it's possible if people want to sign up on the Green and Open Spaces, you know, you could put an asterisk if it's okay to share your email with me, and you know, I would like to get a little committee, you know, going that's, you know, might be something like a Save Somerville Wildlife Group. Learn about the political process, you know, what is it that we need to do, you know, if we want to see some change here in Somerville, starting with the banning of the use of the escars on public property, maybe working our way up to a home rule petition. But you know, Claire, who's a part of Earthwise Aware, you know, she also lives in Somerville. We're going to need a group in order to get something going. So so please sign up with Green and Open Spaces and put an asterisk, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. I actually added a column.
Oh, great.
There's a regular mailing list, or decaying mailing list, and now there's a rat mailing list.
Excellent.
And I will, I guess, Mary, will share with you.
That'd be
and
great.
just so everybody knows, if you're signing up, if you're putting in your check mark in the rat column, I'm going to share that with Mary.
And of course
And I just wanted to, oh, sorry.
No, that's fine.
What?
I would just also want to see if we are, you know, really gathering together. I also encourage people to document what they see. Using this brigade is a nice way to have collective data and to understand, you know, the cross correlation between, you know, the wildlife that is likely impacted and those bait boxes. You know, data at the end is going to be something that's going to push for policy making.
And that website was anecdata.org, and then you look for Escar Brigade.
Well, we can share that too.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And before we wrap up, and I'm sorry we have to be out of this room in 15 minutes and we have to clean up, but Colin, I'm not trying to put you on the spot if you want to say something. Colin Ziegler is our rat czar.
Hi everybody. So initially I wanted to thank Laura for her amazing work. It's people like herself that get everyone organized and doing things and moving us in the right direction. They really drive change. So I just want to thank Laura for the presentation and her continued work and engaging with folks. So the city of Somerville in many ways is leading in a number of different directions in terms of rodent control. Some in the past have not been very effective and have been counterproductive, as we've learned tonight. For example, baiting in the sewers. My second week in this position, that was cut out. We understand that that is not something that we need to do, and there's no reason why we cannot continue to get rid of past policies and procedures to make better results and make real significant change in our local environments. So with the implementation of smart boxes as a poison-free method, with an emphasis on education and enforcement, the city is working on a revamped IPM plan that we're working directly with the mayor's office as well as 5 other departments on how they behave internally in response to rodents and prevention and education with folks they interact with. And on top of that, I'm very excited to announce that in discussions with the mayor's office and DPW is reconsidering their contract using rodenticide on public schools and grounds, starting today. So what that means is that they're going to observe their contracts, find ways that they can cut out rodenticides entirely while implementing integrated pest management plans for each of those areas with Alicia and myself. That goes through the process of food, water, and shelter identification and access vectors, and then subsequently long-term monitoring and reporting. So internally, the city is working to reduce the use. We have many things to address still. Laura mentioned that construction, demolition, and vacancy permits require some sort of rodent reporting and monitoring or a rodent control plan as a means to receive a permit. We are working on revamping that language to make sure that large-scale developments, like what we've seen here in Union Square, or what is referred to as level 3 construction, requires a IPM plan with monthly reports sent to the city, and those who fail to do those monthly reports and IPM planning will receive a violation for subsequent inaction. So in addition to that, we're looking at bolstering ISD to enhance the enforcement arm, to discourage some of the bad actors that happen to be in our city and are operating in a not so helpful way to the rodent population and controlling it. Additionally, we have a new rodent communications plan that's in full swing. Be on the lookout for those communications. They're extremely helpful. I encourage you all to attend spring meetings for the communities in your specific wards, as well as the all-ward meetings, as well as the fall ones. And then we also have the Special Issues Committee for the City Council. Councilor Kelly has since left her position, so we're waiting for a new chair for that committee to call a meeting. But at that meeting, we'll hopefully be in the process of presenting the new IPM and some of the new exciting methods that we're utilizing, all of which we hope to be completely poison-free. So I want to thank you all for your patience. Oh, one last thing. The resident, Colin Ziegler, I'm the Environmental Health Manager for the City of Somerville through Inspectional Services, and this is Alicia Prevette, the new Environmental Health Coordinator, who's going to be helping me with all this work. As you all know, we have the residential program, which has used and does use rodenticide as a means of control. But what we wanted to do, and we finally did it in this most recent contract, is offer the ability for folks to use carbon monoxide as a method of direct rodent control for qualifying properties. Some of our most heavily infested homes are in low-income spaces. They have 10, 20, 30 boroughs. And we feel as though carbon monoxide has showed some extremely promising results. And one last thing, we're partnering with the City of Cambridge in developing a contrapest pilot. We had done it in the past. There were some hiccups. Also, Community MacArthur Street over in Ward 2 did it with mixed results. But we want to test it again to see if it's a municipal approach that we can use for special cases and situations in the future. I know that was a lot. I know we're running out of time. We all have questions. So if you would like to talk further, I'll be here afterwards.
I just want to say again, savearlingtonwildlife.org is my website. There's like a bunch of stuff. There's an activist toolkit to get started. There's a frequently asked questions site, and you can also follow me on Facebook, Save Arlington Wildlife, and I frequently post, and you can both message me through my website or through, you can DM me through the Facebook page, and I'm usually pretty accessible one or both of those ways.
Laura, thank you so much. This was
Thanks.
wonderful.
Thank you.